The proud Duke of Marchmont raised his glass beneath the blazing chandeliers of the long gallery, and in a voice trained to carry he said, "I give you the happy news, before all our friends, that my ward Miss Eleanor Vane is promised in marriage to Mr. Cassius Thorne." A murmur ran along the gilded room like a drought through dry leaves. The merchant rose at the far end of the table, broad and dark, in good cloth, and inclined his head to the gathered company, and the candle flames swayed, and the silver gleamed, and somewhere a fiddle paused between figures of the dance. Eleanor Vane stood near the cold marble of the chimney-piece with her hands folded at her waist, and she did not move. She was 24, chestnut-haired, gray-eyed, and she had been schooled since girlhood to keep her face as smooth as still water, no matter what stone was thrown into it. So she kept it now. She felt the heat of 50 pairs of eyes turn upon her, weighing, pitying, calculating, and she let them weigh. She inclined her head a careful half-inch toward Mr. Thorne, as a well-bred ward ought, and she said nothing at all, because nothing was what she had been given leave to say. But beneath the folded hands, beneath the pale gray silk of a gown chosen for her by her aunt, her heart beat with a steadiness that would have astonished every soul in that gallery had they known its cause. They believed they were watching a poor relation handed off like a parcel to settle her guardian's accounts. They believed they saw a girl with no fortune, no power, and no choice. They were wrong on every count, and the wrongness of it sat in her chest like a warm coal she dared not let glow. For Eleanor Vane already knew 3 things that no one in that bright room suspected. She knew, first, that the proud Duke of Marchmont was ruined. Not embarrassed, not pinched, but ruined to the marrow. That the great house of Marchmont stood upon a foundation of borrowed money so deep and so rotten that a single firm push would bring the whole gilded edifice down into the dust. She knew the figures. She had seen them. She had copied them out by candlelight in a fair clerk's hand. Every mortgage and every note of hand, every gambling debt scrawled on the back of a card and honored at ruinous interest, and she knew to the shilling what her guardian owed and to whom. She knew, second, that the man to whom she had just been promised, Cassius Thorne, the shrewd merchant in good dark cloth, was not the chief creditor of the house of Marchmont as he believed himself to be. He held a great wedge of the debt, it was true. The Duke had betrothed his ward to him precisely to wipe that wedge away. A daughter for a ledger, a marriage for a quittance. But Thorne did not hold the rest. The rest had been bought up quietly, note by note, over 18 patient months, by a man of business named Pruitt, acting for a principal whose name appeared on no paper anyone in that gallery would ever see. Eleanor knew the principal's name. She had only to look in a glass to find it. And she knew, third, and this was the warm coal. This was the secret she carried folded against her heart like a letter, that she was not Miss Eleanor Vane, friendless ward, to be disposed of at her guardian's pleasure. She was, in the eyes of God and the law, and a parish register 60 miles to the north, a married woman. She had been for half a year. She was the wife of Henry St. Maur, Duke of Harrogate, the one man in all that proud county who had looked at the silent gray-eyed girl in her aunt's cast-off silks and seen, plainly and at once, exactly what she was worth. She kept her face like still water and let the toast go round. It had not always been so. Eleanor could remember, if she let herself, the years when she had been only what they took her for. She had come to Marchmont as a child of 7, an orphan, a charity of the blood, brought into the great cold house after her parents died of a fever within a week of one another. Her Aunt Augusta, Lady Marchmont, her mother's sister by marriage, had received her with a sigh and a kind of nervous, fluttering charity, settling her in the small north room with the chimney that smoked, dressing her in what the Duke's daughters had outgrown, educating her enough to be useful and not enough to be ambitious. She had been told, gently and often, what a fortunate girl she was. She had been told to be grateful. She had learned to be silent, which is a different thing, and a more useful one. And in the long silences of that house she had learned to watch. She watched the Duke of Marchmont stride through his halls like a man who had never in his life imagined the floor might give way beneath him, silver at his temples, scorn in his mouth, certain to the bone of his own superiority. She watched him lose at cards in the Blue Saloon and laugh as though the loss were nothing. And she watched the men who came afterward to the steward's door, quiet men with leather cases, who were never announced and never named at dinner. She watched her aunt grow thin with a fear she would not speak of, counting candles, dismissing servants one by one, selling the small things first, a snuff-box here, a string of pearls there, as a drowning house sells off its furniture board by board before it goes under entire. Eleanor had been clever with figures from a child. It was the one accomplishment no one thought to forbid her, because no one imagined a girl would have any use for it. So she had made herself useful to Mr. Pruitt, the Duke's man of business, a spare and careful gentleman of 60, who came twice a month to wrestle with the accounts of a house that did not wish to know its own accounts. She copied for him. She cast up sums he was too tired to cast. And somewhere in the third year of this quiet labor, Mr. Pruitt, who had served the family before this Duke was born, and who loved the old name more than he could stomach the man who now disgraced it, had looked at her over his spectacles one gray afternoon and said, very low, "You see it then. You see how it stands." "I see it," Eleanor had answered. "He does not," said Pruitt. "He will not. He believes a great name cannot fall, because he has never seen one fall. He is wrong." And then, after a silence in which the fire ticked and settled, the old man had said the thing that changed the course of her life. "There is something you do not know, Miss Eleanor. Something about your own blood. I have kept it because I was bid to keep it, and because the keeping was for your good. But you are grown now, and cleverer than the lot of them, and I think the time is near when you ought to know." What he told her in that smoke-smelling study with the rain on the windows was this. Her grandfather had been an earl, the Earl of Renfield, attainted for treason in a rising long ago, his title struck off, his estates forfeit to the crown, his very name made a thing to be whispered. The family had scattered into poverty and silence. Eleanor's mother had married down and died young, and the child had been taken in at Marchmont as a nameless charity, and that, the world believed, was the end of the house of Renfield. But it was not the end. For the attainder had been quietly reversed, Eleanor's grandfather pardoned long after his death, the stain lifted by a crown that had outlived its old fears, and the forfeit estates, or the better part of them, had been restored to the heirs of his body. The papers had gone through slow and obscure channels, unremarked, while the only living heir was a silent girl in a smoking north room who did not know her own name was worth anything at all. "You are an heiress, Miss Eleanor," Pruitt had said. "Not a great one by the measure of dukes, but a true one. Land in the north, sound and let, and the rents of it banked these many years and never touched, because there was no one to touch them and no one who knew. It is yours. It has been yours since you were 19. They do not know. He does not know." The old man's voice had dropped lower still. "And if you are wise, if you are as wise as I believe you to be, you will not tell them. Not yet. A secret is a kind of fortune too, and you have been given both. Spend neither in haste. she had not spent either in haste. That was 5 years gone, and in 5 years Eleanor Vane had learned what patience could buy. With the rents of the restored estate, banked and grown, she had a fortune of her own, modest beside the blazing pretense of Marchmont, but real, which Marchmont was not. And so when Pruitt came to her one autumn with his spectacles pushed up into his white hair and a strange light in his tired eyes, and said that the holders of the Duke's worst debts were growing nervous, and might be persuaded to sell their paper cheap to anyone with ready money and a cool head, Eleanor had understood him perfectly, and had not flinched. "Buy them," she had said. "In whose name?" "In yours, Mr. Pruitt, as trustee. The principal's name need not appear." And she had looked at him very steadily and said the thing she had been turning in her mind through 100 silent dinners. "Let him sell me. Let him hand me to his creditor and call it a kindness, and stand in his bright gallery and toast his own cleverness. And while he does it, let us quietly gather up every other note he has ever signed, until the day comes when the whole of his ruin lies in one pair of hands. My hands." She had folded those hands then, just as she folded them now in the long gallery. "He traded on my silence all my life. I mean to be paid for it." So the notes had been bought, month upon patient month, and laid up in Pruitt's strong box like a sheaf of arrows, and the trap, all unknown to the proud man who had built it for her, had closed soft as a glove about the one who set it. But that was not the whole of it. That was not even the heart of it. For in the midst of those gray, careful, ledger-ruled months, something had happened to Eleanor Vane that no ledger could have foretold, and his name was Henry. She had met the Duke of Harrowgate first across a county dinner table, where she sat below the salt among the poor relations, and he sat in the high place his rank required. For Harrowgate was the oldest dukedom in the county, and outranked Marchmont as an oak outranks a sapling. He was a quiet man in his late 30s, with a grave, still face and a way of listening that was rare in great men, and he had been widowed young and had never seemed to look at the marriage market with any hunger at all. The county thought him cold. Eleanor, watching from below the salt as she watched everything, thought he was not cold but only careful, a man who had learned, as she had learned, to keep his deepest face turned away from a world that would only misread it. He had spoken to her by accident, the first time, some matter of an account, a charity subscription that Marchmont had pledged and not paid, and Harrowgate, who administered it, had wanted the figures, and no one at that end of the table could give them but the silent ward, who gave them at once to the shilling from memory. She had seen his grave eyes change. Not widen, he was too contained for that, but change, the way still water changes when a light is carried near it. He had looked at her then not as a poor relation or a charity or a parcel, but as a person, as, indeed, the cleverest person at that table, which she was. "You keep the Marchmont accounts," he had said quietly, not as a question. "I keep what they will let me keep," she had answered, "and I see the rest." "And what do you see?" And because he had asked her as though her answer mattered, the first man in 17 years to do so, she had told him a little of the truth, low and even, the way one tests ice. He had listened. He had not flinched, nor flattered, nor told her she was a fortunate girl. He had only nodded slowly, as a man does when a thing he had half suspected is confirmed, and from that hour the two of them, the silent ward and the careful Duke, had found 100 small reasons to speak. She would not pretend, even to herself, that it had been a sudden blaze. It had been a slow warming, like a hearth banked at night that you do not see catch, but wake to find a light. He courted her in the only currency she trusted, which was respect. He sent her, by the hand of her maid Bess, books she had wanted and could not buy. He asked her opinion on matters of his own estate and took it. He never once in all those months spoke to her as though her worth were a thing he conferred upon her rather than a thing he merely had the wit to see. And when at last he asked her to marry him, gravely, plainly, on a frost-bright morning in a lane where no one of the county could see a duke speaking to a ward, he had said, "I have looked a long while, Eleanor, and I have not found your better, and I do not expect to. Marchmont means to sell you to clear his books. Let him try. Be my wife, and let him try." They had married in secret 60 miles to the north, in a small gray church near the lands that were her own, with Pruitt for a witness and Bess for the other, and no one else in all the world the wiser. It was not cowardice that kept it secret, but strategy. Henry's strategy and hers together. Two careful people who had each spent a lifetime learning when to show a card and when to hold it. Let him make his arrangements, Henry had said. Let him stand up before the county and trade you away. And then, in the fullness of time and on the ground of our choosing, we will let the county learn whom they have insulted. She had laughed at that, she, who laughed so seldom, and he had looked at her laughing as though it were the finest thing he had ever earned. Half a year, a wife then, and not a soul at Marchmont knew it. She had gone home to her smoking north room after the wedding, and folded the marriage lines into the bottom of her workbox beneath the skeins of gray wool. And she had waited, and watched, and gathered her arrows. And now she stood in the long gallery, while her guardian toasted her sail, and she kept her face like still water, and she let him. The toast was drunk. Glasses came down. Mr. Thorne crossed the gallery toward her with the heavy assured tread of a man taking possession of a purchase, and made her a creditable bow, and said some civil grasping thing about the honor she did him, and Eleanor gave him her careful half-inch of a curtsy and her downcast eyes, and thought, with a calm that surprised even herself, "You honor a married woman, sir, and do not know it." Across the room her Aunt Augusta watched, with a face pinched white between relief and shame, relief that the thing was settled, shame that it had come to this, and the Duke of Marchmont stood tall beneath his blazing chandeliers, silver-templed, certain, looking out over a room that he believed he owned, and did not know that every candle in it was lit on borrowed oil, and that the girl he had just sold held the wick. It was very late, and the guests long gone, when Bess came up the cold back stair to Eleanor's room with a letter in her apron and her honest face all wrong. "Come by a rider not an hour since, miss," Bess whispered, though there was no one to hear. "From the north. He would not stop for the kitchen. He said it was to your own hand and no other." And she gave it over, and Eleanor saw the seal before she saw anything else, the green wax, the Harrogate green, the color of the man who was her husband, and a small glad warmth rose in her that this should come tonight of all nights. Tonight when she had stood and been sold and said nothing, that his hand should reach her across 60 miles of dark. But the green seal was edged in black. Eleanor sat very still upon the edge of her narrow bed with the letter in her lap, and the candle threw her shadow tall upon the smoke-stained wall, and for a long moment she did not break the wax. She had schooled her face to stillness all her life. She had never until this moment had to school her hands. They were not quite steady as she turned the letter to the light, and read, beneath the black-edged green, a clerk's careful hand and not her husband's own, and the world she had so patiently built, arrow by arrow and note by note, tilted on its quiet axis and began, without a sound, to fall. "Bess," she said at last, and her low voice was level by main force, Level the way a wall is level that has been built true against the day the flood comes. Go down and tell them I am unwell, and will keep my room tomorrow. And Bess, fetch out my gray. The morning gray from the cedar press. Her gray eyes lifted to the candle and did not blink. I shall have need of it sooner than they think. The gray came as the green had not. Bess laid it out across the bed without a word, the color of ash and old pewter, and Eleanor stood at the window with the Harrogate letter still warm in her hand and understood, before she had read past the second line, that the worst thing in the world had already happened, and that no one in the house yet knew it but her. The hand was not Henry's. That was the first wrong note. Henry wrote a low, level hand, the letters leaning forward as if eager. This was the cramped, careful script of a steward, and stewards wrote in their master's stead only for two reasons, and one of them was joy. She read it standing. A bay gelding, a wet morning, a stone wall at the bottom of the long meadow that he had taken 100 times and took once more without thinking, and a fall, and the ground, and a silence into which the whole of her life had quietly fallen with him. He had lingered a single day. He had asked for her at the end, the steward wrote, and had been told she could not be reached in time, and had nodded as though that, too, were only what was owed, and had closed his eyes. She did not cry out. She had been schooled to silence so long that grief, when it came inward, like water finding a low place. She sat down on the edge of the bed beside the gray gown and put the letter against her mouth and breathed. Once, twice, until the room steadied around her. Bess crossed to her and knelt, and took her free hand and held it hard, and that was all, and it was enough, because Bess had carried the messages, and Bess knew whose widow she now was. For she was a widow. The thought arrived slowly, turning, showing first its grief and only afterward its shape. Eleanor Vane, ward of Marchmont, promised over the soup to a merchant like a parcel of land, was gone. In her place, and no soul under this roof suspected it, sat Eleanor St. Moore, Dowager Duchess of Harrogate, relict of Henry, who had been a duke of older blood and higher precedence than Roland Ashcombe would ever hold, though Roland lived to be 100. She had married him in a country church with 2 witnesses, and the banns read 3 Sundays in a parish where no one knew her face, and she had told no one because telling was a weapon, and weapons were not drawn until the field was chosen. Now the field had chosen her. Henry had left her his name, his jewels, his jointure, and the great house at Harrogate Hall with its long meadow and its low wall, and he had left her alone to use them. "You'll wear the gray for him after all," Bess whispered. "But not the way they think." "Not the way they think," Eleanor agreed, and her voice did not shake, and that frightened Bess more than weeping would have. She went down to breakfast in the gray, because the household had called for mourning, and mourning they should have. And let them imagine it was mourning for a girl's lost prospects rather than for the only man who had ever looked at her and seen a person of consequence. The dining room was bright and cold. The Duke sat at the head with the newspaper held like a shield, and Lady Marchmont fluttered over the coffee, and at the side table, taking chocolate as though he had every right to the house already, stood Cassius Thorne. "There she is," said Thorne, and set down his cup, and looked at her the way he looked at everything, as a sum to be totted. "You'll forgive me, Miss Vane, for calling so early. A man likes to look at what he's bought." He smiled to take the edge from it, but the edge was the meaning, and they both knew. "In gray. Very dutiful. Mourning the freedom of the single state, I suppose. We'll mend that quick enough." "Mr. Thorne," said the Duke, lowering his paper an inch, "does not stand on ceremony. It is one of his charms. The word charm in his mouth was a coin he was paying out grudgingly, and Thorn heard it, and his jaw tightened. And Eleanor filed the small friction away as she filed everything, against future need. "Sit, Eleanor," said Lady Marchmont too brightly. "Take something. You look pale." "I am quite well, Aunt," Eleanor said, and sat, and folded her hands, and was silent in the way she had perfected, the silence that men took for submission and women, sometimes, recognized as a closed door. She let Thorn talk. He talked of warehouses and of a ship lately come in from Lisbon and of the price of cochineal, and twice he reached across and touched the back of her chair. Not her, but the chair. The way a man rests his hand on a thing he means to move. She did not flinch. She thought of a low wall in a wet meadow and kept her face smooth as a pond under ice. It was the Duke who delivered the second wound, and he did it the way he did everything, as if conferring a favor. He folded the newspaper, at last, with the air of a man getting to the true business of the morning, and addressed Thorn over Eleanor's bent head as though she were a fixture of the room. "You'll want the thing settled and dated," he said. "I am not a man to leave a matter loose. The notes you hold, and you hold a good many, Cassius, I'll not pretend otherwise, come due at quarter day. Michaelmas. Some 11,000 and odd, all told, with the Pruitt mortgages folded in." He said the figure the way other men said the name of a horse they were proud of, with a sort of swagger, as if the size of the debt were itself a kind of grandeur, proof that he moved in sums beyond ordinary reckoning. "On the day she marries you, the slate is wiped. You forgive the lot, I give you the girl, and Marchmont stands clear and clean as it stood in my grandfather's day. A neat bargain, a gentleman's bargain, a merchant's bargain," said Thorn, "which is to say one that adds up." He looked at Eleanor again. 11,000. "You're a costly article, Miss Vane. See you prove worth the price." Eleanor lifted her eyes then just once and looked at her guardian, at the silver at his temples, the certainty in the set of his mouth, the absolute and untroubled confidence of a man announcing the date of his own salvation, and she said mildly, "Michaelmas is very soon, uncle, soon enough to suit me," said the Duke. And that was the whole of the attention he paid her, and he turned to Thorn to speak of the wedding breakfast. She had the figure now, and the day. 11,000 and odd, Michaelmas, the Pruitt mortgages, folded in. She turned it over under her smooth face the way one turns a key already cut, feeling for the wards. Because the Duke did not know, could not have dreamed, what Pruitt knew, which was that the mortgages folded in were no longer Thorn's to forgive at all. That was the work she went to next, and she went to it that same week, in the gray, behind a face of grief, while the house thought her broken and biddable and counting down her last free days. She wrote to Pruitt, and Bess carried it, and 3 days later Pruitt came on the ordinary business of the estate with his black bag and his spectacles, and a look in his eye that the Duke, sweeping past him in the hall, never troubled to read. They met in the small morning room with the door open, because a closed door invites a listener and an open one invites none. Pruitt spread his papers on the table between them with the tenderness of a man dealing a winning hand he has waited years to play. "It is done as you wished, Your Grace," he said, very low, and the title in his mouth, the first time any servant had given it to her aloud, went through her like a swallow of warm wine. "Forgive an old man the liberty of it. I have wanted to say it since the letter came. Mr., his late Grace, God rest him, was the only man in this county who ever paid you what you were owed, and I'll see his widow paid the rest." "Tell me plainly, Pruitt," she said. "All of it. No softening." He told her plainly. The Harrogate jointure was settled, and the lawyers had confirmed it. She had, in her own right, command of a fortune that made the Duke's 11,000 look like a tradesman's slate, which, she thought, was precisely what it was. And with that fortune, quietly, through 3 banking houses and a wine merchant in the city who owed Henry a kindness, Pruitt had been buying, not buying Thorne off, buying Thorne out. The bills, the bonds, the post-obit notes, the second mortgage on the home farm and the first on the dower house, and the ruinous private loan the Duke had taken to cover a night at the tables 3 winters back and never told his wife of, Pruitt had gathered them in, one by one, paying Thorne his price and a little over for the trouble. So that the merchant, flattered and made whole and thinking himself merely cashing out of a slow debt to clear the way for a marriage, had signed the whole bundle over without once asking who, behind the wine merchant and the city men, was the true purchaser. He holds the marriage as his prize, Pruitt said, and thinks the debt his sweetener, to be torn up at the altar. He does not know the debt has walked out the back door while he admired the bride at the front. As of Tuesday last, every note against this house is held in one hand. He laid a last paper flat and turned it so she could read it. Yours. Eleanor looked at the long column of them. The careful list in Pruitt's cramped steward's hand. The same cramped hand, she thought with a lurch, that had written her the news of Henry, and she understood that the man at the head of the breakfast table had, in the space of one summer, given away the one person on earth who had quietly become his creditor, his better, and his judge. And the date? She asked. They come due at Michaelmas, as he says. Quarter day. He may pay, or he may default. He cannot do the first. Pruitt took off his spectacles and polished them, which was what he did instead of smiling broadly, for he was a careful man. If you call them, Your Grace, on the day, in form, and you have every right, the notes are clean and the dates are sound, he has nothing to set against them but this estate. The chairs he sits in, the roof, the name. I do not want the chairs, she said. No, said Pruitt. I did not think you did. It is a finer thing than chairs you're after. And he did not say what it was, because they both knew, and naming it would have cheapened it, the way naming grief cheapens it. There was the matter, still, of the salt. It came on the Sunday before the ball. At the long dinner Sir Edmund Caulfield gave for the chief families of the county, a dinner that was in truth a rehearsal of precedents, a sorting of who should walk before whom, conducted under the cover of a roast and 3 removes. Eleanor went in the grey, on the Duke's arm because a ward had no other, and was seated. She watched it happen, watched Sir Edmund's careful man move the cards, below the salt, below the heavy chased silver cellar that marked, on Caulfield's old-fashioned table, the boundary between those who mattered and those who were suffered. A ward, an orphan, a girl promised to a merchant, belonged below it. The merchant himself, by some delicate calculation of money against blood, was seated above, near the Duke, where he beamed and carved and called the length of the table to Eleanor twice, loudly, to ask was she warm enough down there, as though her place were a joke they might share. She was warm enough. She ate little and watched much. She watched the Duke preen at the head of the table, and Lady Marchmont laugh too long at the host's small jokes, the laugh of a woman who lies awake doing sums. She watched Thorne mistake the deference paid his money for deference paid himself. She watched Sir Edmund, who loved rank more than he loved his own children, move through his dinner like a priest through a mass, and she thought, You have made an altar of precedence, Sir Edmund, and you do not know that the highest-ranked woman who will ever sit at your table is sitting tonight below your salt, in grey, saying nothing, being asked, Is she warm enough? She let them have it. That was the discipline of it, the thing Henry had loved in her and named once, quietly walking in the Harrogate garden, that she could hold a truth in her hand for as long as the holding served, and not spend it for the cheap relief of being known. Let them have the dinner. Let them have the joke about the salt. Let Thorn call down the table, and the Duke boast of Michaelmas and Sir Edmund sort his cards. The day was coming when the cards would sort themselves, and it would not be Sir Edmund's hand that moved them. That night she did not sleep. Bess found her near dawn at the window of the green-papered room with a candle burned to a stub, and did not scold her, only brought a shawl and stood by. "He'd not want you gray through and through, my lady," Bess said softly, "inside as well as out. He'd want you to grieve him, I know it. But he'd want the other thing too. He told me once, when I carried the letter about the banns, he said, 'She is the cleverest creature in 3 counties, and the world has never once let her show it.' He said it like a man vexed on your behalf." Eleanor turned from the window. In the gray light her eyes were dry and very steady. "He did say that," she said. "He said it to me as well. He said a day would come when I should stop being clever in the dark." She drew the shawl close. "Open the press, Bess, the bottom, under the linen. The box from Harrogate." Bess knelt and drew it out, the long, flat traveling box with its brass corners, and set it on the bed and lifted the lid, and the candlelight ran along what lay inside and woke it. The gown first. Not gray, not the dove and pewter of a ward in mourning, but a deep and lustrous green. The green of the Harrogate livery, the green of the letter that had begun it all, cut in the new long line and trimmed at the breast and sleeve with old blonde lace that had been 3 Harrogate duchesses before her, and beneath it, in worn morocco cases, the Harrogate jewels, the emerald drops, the collar of old square-cut stones that caught even the poor light and threw it green across the ceiling, the great brooch shaped like a martlet that the saint Moors had worn since before there was a Duke of Marchmont at all. Eleanor took up the topmost case but did not open it. Instead, she reached past the jewels to the flat packet wrapped in oiled silk that lay at the bottom of the box, beneath everything, where Bess had not looked, and she unwrapped it on the counterpane. 2 documents, side by side. The marriage lines, the register's copy, signed and sealed, Henry St. Maur and Eleanor Vane, the date, the witnesses, the parish, proof in plain ink that she was who she was. And beside it, the long folded sheaf Pruitt had left with her, the schedule of notes, every debt against the house of Marchmont gathered into one column, with the day they fell due written at the foot in the steward's careful hand. Michaelmas, the morrow's morrow, the day of the ball. She laid them together, the marriage and the money, the love and the reckoning, side by side in the candlelight, and looked at them a long while, and let herself, just once, alone but for Bess, set her hand flat upon Henry's name and feel the whole weight of what it had cost to come to this, that to win she had had to lose him first, that the rank she would wear into Caulfield's Hall the next night was a widow's rank, bought with the only happiness she had ever owned. "Tomorrow," she said at last, and her voice was low and steady and entirely her own, "I shall be announced." Bess closed the box softly over the green and the green fire of the stones. Outside, the first birds began, and somewhere far down the dark county road the Harrogate carriage, sent for in secret, was already turning its horses' heads toward the house, its panels bearing the martlet, its lamps unlit, coming to carry a widow to a ball where every soul still thought her a ward in gray, waiting below the salt, warm enough, saying nothing, and ready, now, at last, to speak. Sir Edmund Caulfield's footman struck the floor 3 times with his staff, and the great doors at the head of the stair stood open upon a room that did not yet know it was about to be undone. The orchestra had paused between figures. Candlelight ran along 400 lustres of cut glass, and the county turned, as it always turned, to see who had come late enough to be announced. Below in the ballroom, Roland Ashcombe, Duke of Marchmont, stood near the dais with Cassius Thorne at his elbow and his wife's gloved hand upon his arm. And he was smiling the smile of a man who has weathered a hard season and means to be seen weathering it well. He had told 3 separate gentlemen that evening that the betrothal would be announced before supper. He had let it be understood that the merchant's money was a convenience he stooped to, not a rope he clung to. The footman drew breath, and the name he gave the room was not the name anyone in it expected. Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate. For the length of a held breath there was no sound at all but the small hiss of the candles. Then the whole room moved at once, the way a field of wheat moves when the wind crosses it, every head bending the same way toward the stair. Eleanor Vane stood at the top of it in Harrogate green. Not the muted green of half-mourning, but the deep forest color of the house she had married into. A gown cut with the plain severity of true rank. No flounces, no false modesty. Only good silk that took the light and gave it back darkly. At her throat lay the Harrogate emeralds, the old set, the ones the county had last seen on a duchess 30 years dead. And every woman in the room who knew jewels knew at a glance that these were not paste and not borrowed. Her chestnut hair was dressed simply. Her gray eyes were steady, and she came down the great stair without haste, one gloved hand resting on the rail, as though the house and the hour and the 400 candles had all been arranged for her convenience, and she was a little sorry to have kept them waiting. Sir Edmund Caulfield met her at the foot of the stair, and the stickler for precedence in him had already done the arithmetic that his astonishment could not stop. A Duke of Harrogate outranked a Duke of Marchmont by a century and a half of patent. The widow of the one carried that precedence upon her person until she died or married again. He bowed, and it was the lowest bow he had given anyone that season. "Your Grace," he said, "you honor my house. Sir Edmund." Her low voice carried no further than it needed to, and somehow the whole room strained to it. "You were kind to send your card to Harrogate Hall. I came because I have business in the county that is best concluded where it began." Across the floor, Roland Ashcombe had gone the color of tallow. He had heard the name and not believed it. He had watched her descend and told himself it was some cousin, some claimant, some trick of the candlelight upon a stranger. But there was no mistaking the set of those shoulders, schooled to silence in his own house these many years, nor the gray eyes that had looked at him across his own dinner table the night he told her she would marry a merchant and be grateful for it. The ward he had given away in March stood in June at the foot of Caulfield's stair, wearing the rank of the one man in England who had outranked him, and the room was bowing to her. Augusta's hand tightened on his sleeve until he felt her nails through the cloth. "Roland," she whispered. "Roland." The name. Did he say Harrogate? He said Harrogate. "Be quiet," her husband said, and did not know he had said it aloud. Eleanor crossed the floor. The crowd parted for her without being asked, the way water parts, closing again behind her into a slow following tide, for no one in that county would have missed what came next for the price of their own estates. She walked to the dais where precedence was kept, and Sir Edmund, helpless before his own most sacred law, conducted her past Marchmont, past the Lord Lieutenant's empty chair, to the place at the head of the room that belonged that night to the highest rank present. She did not sit. She turned, with the height of the dais beneath her now, and looked down for the first time upon the man who had raised her to give her away. "Cousin Roland," she said, the old courtesy, the ward's word for her guardian, and she set it down between them like a coin she no longer needed. "Eleanor." His voice came out cracked, and he hated it, and could not mend it. "What masquerade is this? You forget yourself. You forget what you are." "No," she said. "I have remembered it. That is what troubles you." A little laughter moved through the listening crowd and was gone, frightened of itself. "In March," she said, and she did not raise her voice, and that was the terror of it. For the room held still as a church to hear her. "You stood in your own drawing room and told me I would marry Mr. Thorne to settle what you owed him. You said a ward has no fortune but what her guardian makes for her, and no worth but what a husband will pay. You said it before my aunt and before Mr. Thorne, and you did not trouble to lower your voice, because you did not think me a person who could answer." Thorne had drawn back a half step. He was a shrewd man, late of nothing and now of everything, and shrewd men know the smell of a turning market before the slow ones do. "I did not answer you then," Eleanor went on. "I had been schooled in your house never to answer. You taught me silence as though it were a virtue, and I learned it better than you knew, for a silent woman hears a great deal. I heard your debts, cousin. I heard them through doors and over ledgers and in the white face of Mr. Pruitt when the quarter day came round. You owed Mr. Thorne, yes, but Mr. Thorne was not the half of it." Marchmont's eyes went, against his will, to where Pruitt stood at the edge of the crowd, gray and quiet, his man of business of 20 years, and something in the old man's steady gaze told him a thing he had not let himself know. "You will recall," Eleanor said, "that my grandfather was an earl, attainted, his estates forfeit before I was born. You spoke of it once a year, at most, and always as a stain. You never troubled to learn what became of the estates. I will tell you, since it is to the purpose. 6 years ago, quietly, by the king's own grace and the labor of better men than either of us, the attainder was reversed in my line. The lands came back. They came back to me, cousin. While I sat at your table eating bread, you grudged me and saying nothing, because a ward who has remembered what she is does not announce it to a man who would only find a way to spend it. The room had stopped breathing. You gave away an heiress, Eleanor said, and called her a charity. It was Augusta who made a sound, a small, broken sound. One hand pressed to her mouth, and Eleanor's gray gaze moved to her aunt and softened by a degree that only those nearest could have marked. You were afraid, aunt, she said more gently. I knew it. Fear is not cruelty, though it can wear its coat. I have not come to harm you. Then back to Marchmont, and the softness was gone like a door closing. There was a man, she said, who did not need to be told what I was. He saw it for himself. He watched you treat me as a thing to be sold, and he came to me, privately and honorably, and he asked me, not my guardian, whether I would be his wife. The Duke of Harrogate married me in March, by special license, 3 days before you announced to your friends that you had disposed of me. I did not wear his name in your house, because I chose the hour myself, and the hour was not yours to give. She let that settle. Somewhere at the back of the room a woman began, helplessly, to weep, the way people weep at the turn of a play when the long wrong is at last made right. He died 11 days ago, Eleanor said. And now her voice changed, and the whole room heard the crack in it that no schooling had ever quite mended. His horse came down on the wet ground below the east field at Harrogate, and he was gone before they reached him. I will not pretend before you that I stand here whole. I loved him. He was the only soul in this county who looked at me and saw a person and not a price, and I have had him 11 days as a memory for every one I had him as a husband. That grief is mine. I will not spend it for your benefit, Cousin Roland, and you may be sure I do not thank you for the years that taught me to recognize kindness only when, at last, I was shown some. She drew breath, and when she went on her voice was level again, the ledger voice, the voice that had counted his ruin through a closed door. But I am his widow. I am the Dowager Duchess of Harrogate, and I am the heiress of my grandfather's restored estates, and I am, as it happens, a woman of very considerable fortune in my own right, which brings me to the business that carried me from a house of mourning to a county ball, for I would not have come for less. She turned, unhurried, to the merchant. Mr. Thorne, your grace. He bowed at once, and there was respect in it and a great deal of swift calculation behind his shrewd eyes. You came here tonight, Eleanor said, to be promised a wife in exchange for forgiving the Duke of Marchmont's debts to you. I will save you the evening. The debts you hold against this house I have bought 3 weeks ago through Mr. Pruitt at full value in good coin. You have been paid, Mr. Thorne. You are not Marchmont's creditor. You have no quarrel left in this room and no bride to wait upon, and a shrewd man, I think, knows when an account is closed to his profit and bows himself out with his money in his hand. Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then, to the lasting astonishment of every gossip present, the merchant smiled, a small dry smile of one professional acknowledging another across a table. It was never my wish to take an unwilling wife, your grace, he said. I dealt in debts, not in chains. You have settled mine handsomely, and I'll own I'd rather be paid in coin than in a woman who'd never have forgiven me. I wish you joy of your fortune. You've a better head for it than most of the men in this room. And he bowed again and stepped back and was, from that moment, no part of the matter at all. It left Marchmont alone in the middle of the floor, with nothing between himself and the dais but the bright, unforgiving air. As for the debts themselves, Eleanor said to him, and she might have been a clerk reading a column, save for the stillness in the room and the white horror in his face, I hold them now. All of them, cousin, not Mr. Thorne's note alone, but the mortgage on the south wing that you thought no living soul had traced, and the bond to the Lombard house in the city, and the gaming debts you signed at Boodle's under another man's name. Mr. Pruitt has held the half of them this 12-month, biting for me. The rest I bought when I came into my fortune. They fall due, every one, at Michaelmas. They are mine to call. She paused, and the room waited as a man waits for the axe. And I do call them. Roland Ashcombe put out one hand to the empty air, found nothing, and sat down hard upon the edge of the dais step, an old proud man folding all at once like a coat slipped from a peg. Augusta went to him. The county watched, and did not gloat, for there is something in the fall of a great house that sobers even those who long to see it. And Eleanor, looking down upon her guardian crumpled at the foot of the rank he had bartered her to lose, did not smile. You will not be turned into the road, she said, and her voice had gone quiet again, almost weary. I am not what you made me. The notes are due, and I have called them, so that you will know to the last farthing that you stand where you stand by my sufferance, and not your own. But Marchmont is my aunt's home, and was my grandmother's before the wars, and I will not pull it down for the pleasure of the noise. You will live on an allowance, cousin, set by Mr. Pruitt, who is an honest man and will not let you ruin yourself again. The house is held in trust. Your debts are forgiven by the only creditor who could forgive them, which is to say by me, on the single condition that you never again in your life pretend to anyone that worth is a thing a man bestows upon a woman, or withholds. You taught me that lie. I have spent a great fortune to teach you it was one. She drew her gloves smooth. That is mercy, Cousin Roland. It is more than you gave me, and it costs me more than you will ever count. And I give it because the man I married would have wished it, and because I find even now that I had rather be his widow than yours to command. Good night. She did not wait for an answer. There was no answer to wait for. She inclined her head to Sir Edmund, who bowed her toward the doors as though she were royalty, and indeed that night she very nearly was, and the county fell back on either side to make her a road, and more than one old woman dipped a curtsy as she passed that had nothing of mockery in it and everything of awe. Pruitt met her in the cold air of the portico, his gray face creased with something that on a less careful man would have been open joy. It is done, then. Your Grace, it is done, Mr. Pruitt. She let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since March. You held faith with me when there was nothing in it for you but risk. I shall not forget it. Come to Harrogate on Thursday. There is a stewardship there that wants an honest man, and I have grown tired of doing without one. The old man's eyes shone, and he bowed, and handed her up himself into the carriage. The Harrogate carriage, green picked out in dull gold, the arms on the door that the county had bowed to for 150 years. Bess was waiting inside with a fur for her knees and a face full of fierce loyal triumph. She was too well trained to speak. Eleanor took her maid's hand and pressed it once, hard, and let it go, and the carriage swung out through Caulfield's gates into the dark of the lanes. For a long while she did not speak. The lamps swung. The June hedges went by black and sweet with the smell of the late hawthorn, and beyond them the fields she had counted from a window now ran out under the moon as her own. She had imagined this night 100 times in the long silence of Marchmont's house, and she had thought in her imagining that it would feel like winning. It did not feel like winning. It felt like the end of a fever, the cool that comes after, when a body discovers how tired it has been all along. He would have done it better than I did, she said at last, half to Bess and half to the dark. Henry, he was never as hard as I had to be tonight. He would have found a way to be just and kind at once and made it look like nothing at all. Her hand closed over the cool weight of the emeralds at her throat, his mother's stones, the morning gift he had clasped there himself with his own 2 hands, and called her, laughing, Your Grace, the first to do it. I wore his colors so the room would understand. But I wore them for him. Bess said nothing, which was the right thing, and pressed the fur closer about her mistress's knees. Toward midnight the carriage turned in at the Avenue of Limes, and there at the end of it stood Harrogate Hall, the great old house gray and silver under the moon, lamps lit in the hall windows for her coming, the windows of her own home, where no one would ever again tell her what she was worth. The horses knew the road and quickened of themselves. Eleanor sat up and dried her eyes once plainly with the back of her glove and looked at the lighted door growing nearer. She had gone out from a guardian's house a ward to be sold, and she came home a duchess in her own right, to a house that was hers, with the man who had given it to her gone before her into the dark, and all the long account at last set straight and paid. The grief would keep. It would walk the halls of Harrogate with her for a great many years, and she would let it, for it was the last and truest measure of how much she had been worth to the one man who had troubled to find out. But tonight the lamps were lit, and the door stood open, and she was expected, and she was home. The carriage drew up. A footman ran down the steps with a lantern, and Eleanor Vane, Dowager Duchess of Harrogate gathered her green skirts in one steady hand and stepped down onto her own ground, into the light of her own house, and went in.